This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ or sign up for our email list to stay up to date on everything we have going on. And to get the most involved, join our free Mighty Networks community to get connected with others living this restorative justice life all over the world. As far as this podcast goes, make sure you're subscribed, leave a rating and review, and share with a friend to help us further amplify this work. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Carl, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
I am a noble savage. I have that of God in me and that of violence within me. Mm-hmm. The great Russian poet Solzhenitsyn said it this way: good and evil is the line between good and evil is drawn right down the middle of our hearts.
Who are you?
I'm a child of war, born and raised in Vietnam. The youngest son of church workers who stayed in Vietnam throughout the war. Fighting came within a half mile of our home in 1968. We also left 3 weeks before Saigon was taken over in 1975. I was 10 at the time. Deep impressions were left in my spirit and my psyche from that experience.
Who are you?
I'm the brother of John, an airline pilot. I'm the brother of Rose, a licensed clinical social worker. Husband to Carolyn, my lifelong companion of 36 years now. Father of Chris, who's a senior app designer for GoFundMe, and his lovely spouse, Ilana, my daughter in love, I call her. And she is a theater actor, director, and production manager and model. And to my daughter, Grace, senior project manager at Deloitte, and her future spouse, Ibrahim, my son-in-love, who's senior sales at Amazon and an amazing person from the African continent.
Who are you?
I'm a practitioner, educator, and advocate for just peace and just reconciliation. I often find myself going towards conflict, not away. That doesn't mean I'm full of courage. Sometimes I have butterflies in my stomach, but I trust the process. And I trust that the people, even in the most gravest of conflicts, there are people of goodwill.
Who are you?
I'm a bumbling ally to my friends and colleagues of color and for racial justice. I'm white, male, middle-aged, and American. I'm surrounded by privilege, but striving to fight for racial equity in the US and across the globe.
Who are you?
I'm a person of faith. I believe there's always a story behind the story. I believe that reality isn't just what we see. There's another reality. And something I learned early on is no matter how horrific the violence or no matter how frightening the context of conflict I might be entering in, I learned early on that there was always signs of the spirit working for healing, for good. And if I could find those places and those people and align myself to them, I was much better off.
And finally, for this segment, who are you?
I'm an artist, a singer, a dancer, a worshiper. I love jazz, a glass of red wine, a good dose of humor, and riding a motorcycle.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Carl, for being here. We're going to explore all the intersections of who you are and more right after this.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Carl Stauffer to the podcast. Carl is an associate professor of justice at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at Eastern Mennonite University. His research focuses on restorative justice as a social movement and the use of indigenous and community justice practices as alternatives to traditional mainstream justice. In this episode, Carl talks about indigenous justice, different means of resistance, and so much more as it pertains to restorative justice. Without further ado, let's get right back into it.
Carl, again, thank you so much for being here on this Restorative Justice Life. We always like to start by checking in. So to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question in this moment, how are you?
I'm in a really incredible place in my life right now. I made a sudden transition out of academia, and I loved academia. I loved the research I was doing. I loved the writing I was doing. I loved the students that I had the opportunity to walk with for 11, going on 12 years. But I moved to the United States Institute of Peace when I saw that they had created a position for the first time on reconciliation. And when I read that, this is going to sound a little cheesy, it felt like it was written for me. I let my wife and children read it, and they said the same. So I went for it. What this place currently brings me is my writing, my publishing, my practice, and a little closer to policy and that funny monster of figuring out if our practice and our policy can affect each other. And so this is where I'm at right now, and this feels right. It has all the joys and challenges that I expected it to have. And yet I have a strong sense of purpose and feeling like I'm in the right place at the right time. And partly that is because I was invited to bring my peace building experience, but also my restorative justice experience and my transitional justice experience into this space.
Yeah, that might be a really good place to enter this conversation, because there are a lot of words that you said that have very specific meanings that often get conflated. Peace building, you said transitional justice, restorative justice. You said in your "Who are you" statements, like you're somebody who has been involved or running towards conflict in many times. I'm curious if you could share a little bit about what each of those terms mean for you and how you got started into doing this work like professionally.
Sure. So let me start with the second question. I entered the field, I say officially, in 1991 as the executive director of a small nonprofit called Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, the Capital Area Victim Offender Reconciliation Program in Richmond, Virginia, the capital of that state. And it was essentially doing restorative justice in its very traditional sense of victim offender encounter in crimes, usually misdemeanor crimes, to try to divert folks out of the system. So I spent 3 years doing that work. And that was really my entry into the field. I had been trained as a community mediator at that point, and my imagination had been caught. That was the late 80s. The mediation movement at that time was sort of the nitty-gritty movement of communities taking their conflicts back. It has changed considerably now. That's another conversation. But that was fueling me. And so this opportunity in Richmond grabbed my imagination, and I was able to help build that program up for a few years before we moved to South Africa, which will be another chapter. Peace building is the framing that has come out of the 1990s, particularly to explain the idea that peace doesn't happen in a quick once-off event. It doesn't happen, suddenly and quickly, and we can't tie it up in a neat bow. It's more like building a structure, and that building sometimes gets blocked by weather. It sometimes gets stopped because we don't have enough money to keep going, and sometimes we build things brick by brick, and we lay the foundation first, then we build the bricks. So the building process gives us a sense that it's not linear and that it's something that we all have to get involved with in order to build the container that's necessary to hold peace and to sustain peace and to protect peace from violence. So it's a deeper process with a systems view of peace. Transitional justice also came about in the early 90s, and it was an umbrella term to try to capture the many different forms of war to peace or systems and structures, approaches that were being applied to war to peace transitions when whole countries were moving out of war or episodes of violence. And so it includes everything from trials to truth commissions to DDR, which is demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of former combatants or fight. Or it has to do with memorialization. How do we remember as a community, as a nation? It has to do with indigenous processes of healing, trauma healing processes, etc. It is a field that I got a lot of my experience from, starting in South Africa, working with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission there. I don't know if you want me to go to restorative justice now or later.
Go ahead.
Okay. Restorative justice to me is a framework. It's a set of principles and practices, and it's a movement that helps us keep our work ethical. So I think it's a critique of transitional justice, because the transitional justice movement globally was basically the Western criminal legal system scaled up, really expensive, not meeting the needs of many people. And restorative justice says, wait, we didn't ask the question, can the criminal legal system, the Western criminal legal system, really deliver the justice we want? And if not, then how do we look at alternatives? And so restorative justice becomes a lens in which I critique a lot of this work.
Yeah.
And that's, aside from the fact that restorative justice has specific practices and it's a service, it's also, I think, a framing movement. And we can talk about that some more as we go. And then there's transformative justice. In the midst of all of this, we've got lots of language. And some people get confused with transformative and transitional, not connected. Transformative justice essentially is a movement that grew out of restorative justice with the critique that restorative justice had too much emphasis on the interpersonal and started at the sort of changing, one relationship at a time. And transformative justice said, we need to change one structure at a time. It's sort of about which comes first. Restorative justice sort of said, as we change people, structures change. I'm being very simplistic here. Transformative justice said, as we change structures, the people will change.
Yeah.
I don't think they're in opposition. I think they work together. They're complementary. We just need to stop throwing stones at each other and figure out how to work together.
Right. And I think a lot of the times the stones are thrown by people who are just coming into understanding the language recently. Like, oh, you're only doing restorative, like transform, right? Things that I've heard, but by people who didn't understand the growth of the movement and the developments of those frameworks. We've given a lot of like heady,
it's very heady, sorry,
and all of this, but a question that I ask folks who come on here is like, even before you knew the word restorative justice, transitional justice, any of those frameworks, there was something in you that was like, hey, I want to do this work. Where did this start for you?
That's a great question. And I'm not going to go through my whole life story, but I'm going to go way back to the beginning. That's why I talked about being a child of war. The war had a really strong impression on me, even though I was always safe, and my parents were incredibly strong and courageous. I can't imagine what they were feeling when we knew the fighting was all around us, and we were under the bed. My mom's praying and reading, and my dad's listening to the radio, trying to figure out how close the fighting is. And eventually we make our way out of that after a neighbor girl breaks curfew and really risks her life to come over and tell us of a way to get out. Through the back of our house, we all get on a scooter and take off. And I have these impressions. They're sort of trauma impressions because I was young. I was 5 or 6 at the time, of empty bullet shells falling on the corrugated tin roof. It's kind of things I remember, getting under the bed and the house shaking. And for me, it was all a bit of an adventure, and my parents remaining amazingly calm was just an incredible witness on its own. But the one thing I talk about, which was a deep, deep impression, is my father went out and took photos right after this. The fighting had come into Saigon in 1968, which was called the Tet Offensive. Tet in Vietnam is the Lunar New Year celebration. So it was a time when the whole city was celebrating, and so it was a perfect time to try to invade from the north. And my father took pictures of the building damage and tanks burned out and the stuff we're seeing whenever we see war. But one of the pictures that he took, and it really left a deep impression on me as a child, was of a dead North Vietnamese soldier. And they wore all black. That was their uniform, so you could pick them out. And this, maybe a trigger warning, I won't go into much more detail. His legs were tied together and he was being drugged, but behind an army jeep through the streets of the city. And people were lining up on the sides of the streets, sort of observing, but some were cheering and jeering. And I mean, this was all a still photograph. You can see that, but I had this deep impression. It wasn't until I was really studying in conflict studies and peace building that I began to contemplate what this meant. And I guess what came to my mind was this had such a strong pull for me because it just, to me, it was the epitome of our inhumanity when we celebrate our victory on the desecration of the enemy dead. And so I think inside of me as a child, that was the beginning to say, we have to figure out how to do this differently.
In your child mind, did you have ideas of what that looked like?
I don't know that I did specifically. I was the youngest child of 3, and I was sort of the family mediator. I do remember that as a kid, sort of the one that wanted to make sure everyone was getting along. I wasn't the stirrers. I was the one that was always trying to accommodate, make sure everyone was happy. So that's something I've had to get over, especially if I have to go into conflict zones. But that mediator bent, that relational bent, was always there and was really important to me. I think my parents' example of trying to be a different face, an upside down narrative compared to the US military, but in the same location. Now, some said that's not possible, and they probably tainted their presence just because of the US military and being the US. In fact, that was certainly an ethical issue. But they were trying to show another face of the American people. And so I was raised in the Mennonite tradition, which is a nonviolent theology from its roots. So that makes a difference. There was a sense of, there was always a sense that we had to do things differently or otherly. Not had to, but that was our task, is to show another way of being, that we could. Mennonites take Jesus nonviolence very seriously. They basically say we can live on earth like that now. It might mean we're martyred, but we can turn the other cheek and all those kinds of things, which sounds really, really lofty and very idealistic. But when you go into a conflict zone, like a war, you have to act that out. You have to either live that or you don't live that, one of the two. And so they modeled that in a very divided and conflictual context.
Yeah. And that is a very, very oppositional view to many people who experience that kind of trauma. And without putting value judgments on any human responses to, war, violence around them, trying to survive, right? There are effects of meeting violence with violence, meeting cruelty with cruelty. And I think those are some of the things that you witnessed as a child. And, it takes somebody, it takes a certain orientation to say, like, I choose not to be that way, versus this is what the people around me are doing. And I guess this is the way that things are, if I want to survive and move through this world. And, I hear a lot of that being rooted in your faith. And I think that's really beautiful. Your faith, part of that, I imagine, is what led you to EMU, Eastern Mennonite University, where, so many of the people who've been on these airwaves, so many people who have been learning and growing this quote unquote restorative justice movement have found as a place of deep learning. But you were there very, very early on, right before CJP was even a thing, the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. What was your early experience at EMU like?
So I was in college in the 80s. I did my undergraduate there in the early 80s. And I studied social work and did a little bit of religious theological studies as a minor. So social work was really an entryway into this work. And EMU, we probably took it for granted. I had family and generational folk who had been connected to EMU, including my father and uncles and grandfather and aunts and so on. But anyway, so I'm all steeped in that. But I became a foreigner to it at times too, because of growing up overseas and being exposed to so many other ways of thinking and being. So I was often a stranger in the midst of the Mennonite community too, in the sense that I knew enough to be inside, but I also knew enough to be outside and poke fun and see where it didn't work. I certainly didn't have a rosy view of Mennonite community in a way that some people from the outside might, and that's okay. My point is, studying social work at EMU was, I remember one of my professors who, he was already pushing us to think about systems. How do we change systems, structures? Dr. Titus Bender. And he had worked in Mississippi during the, when the movie, the burning, was happening, and so that I was already situated through that social work department to be thinking about these things, but in a very different way, because that was the 80s. And we were in a very different place. Unfortunately or fortunately, I don't know which way you want to look at it, but we weren't, today's we have become much more critical and aware. Critical, I'm using that in academic term, critical awareness of racial injustice and injustices writ large and social justice issues.
Yeah, I'm reflective of the words of Fania Davis from the Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice, and this isn't a verbatim quote, but talking about how at the genesis of the quote unquote modern restorative justice movement 40 years ago from now, like there wasn't necessarily that critical race lens, if you will, among people who are intending to do good, right? And the movement grew in some beautiful ways and in some exclusionary ways. And part of the reason that we're here today is talking about listening to the movement in the both actually listening and referencing the book that you helped edit and contributed to. But there has been so much growth. I'm curious, as somebody who has been a part of this from not quite the Howard Zehr Maori victim offended,
right.
But
he was my professor, so yeah.
What are some of the moments that you've seen shifts happen over the last 40 years, 30, 40 years?
Yeah. So when I took that job in Richmond in 1991, you could catch by the name of it, Victim Offender Reconciliation Program. We were actually calling it VORP, what we call now Victim Offender Conferencing.
Yeah.
And you can imagine how problematic reconciliation was in that setting. I mean, it was a very idealistic sort of term that eventually became very problematic because we certainly weren't requiring people to reconcile, and they weren't all reconciling in these processes. And so it moved to victim offender mediation. And we sort of grabbed hold of that mediation model of sort of, this is another way to empower the community to take back its problems and solve its own issues and find a new sense of community and liberty and freedom. And then, as I mentioned, the mediation movement, unfortunately, in many parts of the United States, moved deeply into, or got co-opted into the criminal legal system, so that we're once again seeing lawyers as mediators and lawyers having to sign off on mediation agreements in certain states, which is ludicrous in my mind. But in any case, that's where things have gone. So when we moved, and I'm doing a little bit of a language thing here, when we moved to the conferencing idea or the dialogue idea, we opened up a lot more spaces for us to formulate that facilitation in different ways. And I think that was really important for the maturing of the field. But yes, I would say the first few decades, 70s and 80s, like when I was in college there, it was very much linked to the criminal legal system. It was very much a diversionary thing. It was very much a white middle-class dominant movement. And it was a volunteer movement, and who could volunteer, but primarily, those who had some other forms of wealth. And so it was that very much. Now, I would say Howard Zehr, who was one of the first white graduates from Morehouse, in 1969, had some of that. And so when his book hit the scene in 1990, called Changing Lenses, he introduced this idea of a paradigm, and it became quite controversial. He was saying restorative justice, in essence, he was saying, he didn't use the movement language, but he was saying restorative justice offers us the possibility of a paradigm shift. At that time, paradigm was very much looked at as a blueprint, a map, something you sort of replace one thing with another. A very sort of static sense. It didn't have the evolutionary sense. It didn't have the same sense of movement, ecosystem, that sort of idea of emergent adaptive systems. And so people ended up splitting over this paradigm language, saying it was way too idealistic or too hard. It would never happen. We would never change the system. So let's just work with the system and try to complement it. So the paradigm language, but some people understood that paradigm language and said, we can start to live this out if we work hard enough and start making other applications to restorative justice in other sectors, in other ways, into our lives. And I think that's what led us to this place where we began to talk about it as a movement, but the movement idea is relatively new. And by the way, there's not that many out there. I mean, the whole field of restorative justice, if you will, the discipline is divided. There's a lot of folks who really want to take this into what they think is the status quo of developing a profession, which would be to standardize it and to make sure there's all kinds of criteria for being a facilitator and make it a professionalized, I would say, a banal technical process, which frightens me. And so in the last few years in my academia, since sort of really 2015, 2014, you begin to see just a breathtaking brush of research and theorizing, and then other sectors in society grabbing hold of restorative justice, its principles and values, and making applications, creative applications at the margins. And to me, that was the beginning of saying, we've got a potential movement here. And I use the word potential because it is not some sort of clear movement, in the sense of a critical mass, but it is a movement in the sense that it is being applied, multiplied, and replicated all around the world in significant ways. And it is offering a non-violent justice that we could pass on to the next generation, which may potentially break the state-sanctioned violence of our current criminal legal system.
There's so much in there. I'm grateful for the exposition, and we've talked with many people on these airwaves who have been bringing restorative justice into different spaces. Like a lot of the folks who listen and who have been here talk about restorative justice in education and how the education system is in so many ways a feeder system into the criminal legal system, and how are we breaking education paradigms, frameworks to be more relationship driven instead of just the industrial model of schooling, producing workers for capitalist society, and
Exactly.
valuing relationship and teaching people human relational skills as much as we are teaching math, science, reading, and all those things. But
That's right.
there have been people who have been talking about this work in various other professional settings that have nothing to do with the criminal legal system. And when you talk about like that professionalization, part of me was like, who are these people and where do we stop them, right? And I can name some of them, and I know you can name some of them, and like I very intentionally don't name them here because why expose people to those ideas?
Right. Right.
But there is so much potential for growth. And when you actually made two contributions written to the book, both like the introduction with Sonia Shah and the epilogue where you're talking about the potential for this to become a movement. There were a number of different things where we're, like you were saying, like we are at, to borrow Malcolm Gladwell's framing, of a tipping point, right? Where this could go any number of different ways. This could peter out. I don't think it's going to. I think there are too many of us, but like one of the things that I'm not like angry about, but frustrated by is this conflict of, when I say restorative justice, I probably don't mean the same thing as 8 other practitioners who are like very deeply passionate about this work, and so we're not necessarily moving in the same direction. As somebody who is at the who's been doing this work across a lot of sectors and been in relationship with people who are doing these work in different spaces, how are you? This is assuming that you are, but how are you hopeful that we get into that movement space? Is it together or is it in a more decentralized way?
I've been in the field long enough to know that we're not going to bring everyone with us. So it's going to happen in different, not everyone's going to be on board for sure. I think, well, let me say a little bit about the tendency to move in the direction of technical professionalization and standardization. I understand that it's safe, it's knowable, it's linear. We can say, here's a service that I'm trained in, and I do, and I help people through this process. But we have to ask ourselves, just because it's safe doesn't mean it's healthy or necessarily. Well, there's another question behind that. How much of this is about control? Controlling process, controlling relationships, controlling your own professionalism. And how much are we
preserving structures as they are?
Yes, and controlling, preserving the status quo is part of that control. And so when I talk about the movement, it's messy. It's messy. And that's what makes the folks that want to, narrow this, not broaden the focus, makes them really nervous. Because they're like, well, how do we know if good practice is going on? How do we monitor? How do we, and we don't. Movements, by their very nature, have a life of their own. That's what a social movement is. It takes over, and no one person can define it or lead it. The best we can do, when I talk to my students, was sort of think about the banks of a river. Can we give some boundaries as this movement maneuvers its way down, through the valley. And, some of the things that are really important in that is that means it will be decentralized by nature. It will be localized, and it'll be owned, and decision-making and ownership and redistribution processes of power and social power, as well as other kinds of redistribution of resources in our society will happen in different locales, and our job is to network now. It also means that there's not going to be one great leader anymore. This is leader multiplication. This is multiple leaders at multiple levels doing this work. It also insinuates that there's not going to be static institutions that we can look at, big bricks and mortar institutions, but there's going to be a whole set of other kinds of applications that can hold and hold the movement without being easily definable. And so all that I'm saying sounds really nebulous, and I can understand why that would make people nervous. So what we have to do is we can't really stop a movement. We have to figure out, are we going to get in and swim in the movement, or are we going to swim against the movement? And then, how tired we get if you swim against current.
Yeah,
you'll soon exhaust yourself.
I think one of the arguments that comes up with that nebulous uncertainty is that we are working collectively against very organized, intentional forces that have I'll label them conservative in the capital C, right-wing conservative. Mm-hmm. Like, they have a very clear agenda about how they want the world to be, and almost by any means necessary, they're going to get there. Mm-hmm. And when our movement is a little bit less organized and doesn't necessarily play well with the existing power structures that mm-hmm. govern, for the purposes of this conversation, U.S. society, mm-hmm. That's not safe, to your point. That's disorganized. Right. One of the things that you talked about in the chapter is resisting going for the quick fix legislation that's going to address this one piece of the problem, but not really infuse it with our values and frameworks.
Right.
What do you say to that critique, that fear, that worry, that concern?
Yeah. There's a lot of traps along the way that we need to be really careful about. You triggered something. There was some great research done by a colleague of mine in 2013, and she was looking at other major movements within the criminal legal system over the long history of some hundreds of years. So she was looking at major movements like the probation and parole movement, which was a separate movement on its own. Even the penitentiary, going back to the idea of the penitentiary, which was based on this sort of penance, and what she discovered was astonishing. Almost all of those movements had popular support. They had a very liberational sort of language, idealistic sort of language, and they were going to transform the system. And all of them, she looked at three major ones, I can't remember what the third one was, all of them were eventually swallowed by the criminal legal system as we know it.
Right.
And sort of added to the extension of the long tentacles of our criminal legal system. So very disappointing. So then she asked, what is going on? What happened? What can we discover in this? And how could we possibly learn when we think about the restorative justice movement? Because it was frightening how similar the language was and everything. And within about a 10-year period, the first thing she discovered is within about a 10-year period, all of those movements were nationally legislated. Mm. From the time of their conception of the idea. Yeah. And so the first word of advice she said to the restorative justice field is, be thankful you haven't been nationally legislated yet, because then you would have lost the battle a long time ago, and resist that as much as possible. Now, I'm not completely opposed to legislation and policy change if it's done well with with a lot of reflection on the values that we're trying to promote in the process. And Dr. Talia Gonzalez has done some great work on that side of things with her students. But then the other side of it, what she realized is, she said the other thing that was different about restorative justice movement is early on, we brought in the victim survivor, the harmed, and we brought in, even if it wasn't maybe always so holistic, we brought in the community. And she said all those other movements didn't have that foresight. They focused on the offender and the state and that relationship, the harmed doer in the state. And so she said that's another critical thing, is our inclusion of bringing other folks into the process as much as possible. And that's only expanded, which is, I think, what's helped to drive the movement too, when we start thinking about circle process and the different models that we're using. So those were two very interesting signals, red flags for us to think about as we think about the movement. But yeah, it's uncharted territory. And there's a lot of, yes, as I said, traps along the way. And let me be clear: people who do a particular restorative justice process, and they do it well, and they're professional, and their heart is there, and they feel the empathy and the compassion. And I've been there. I started there. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying it's either or. I'm saying it's both and. We need good service. I used to always tell my students, I want you to be able to facilitate really good services, social services between parties and stuff. You should be able to do that skillfully and professionally and in an impartial way, all of that good stuff. And I want you to be able to ask the hard questions about a system and be able to know where to push a system, where to look at the policies and the procedures and how to ask the hard questions and how to raise the funding and talk to the donors about long-term thinking and how to get this concept framed in a message that will be sold to school boards and get funding from donors for longer periods of time, and think about structures like RJ has done, where they're setting professional, full-time restorative justice practitioners and facilitators in the schools and using it in multiple levels across the school, preventatively as well as responsively.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, are there examples that really come to mind for you? Definitely shout out RJ and the numerous people who've been on this podcast, RJ and Jody and others who have been a part of that work. Are there other examples that provide great quote unquote service, but like are really taking that zoomed out system, community, more public facing approach?
Well, I mean, I really appreciate the work of Impact Justice in the Bay Area. Sujatha and her work, she's held the two together, tried to as much as possible. The work of, like I said, Common Justice in New York, doing some really great work there, trying to hold this together in saying we are relationally focused, we're trauma focused, we're healing focused, and we're also accountability focused and justice focused, and we can do both. We don't have to choose between them.
Yeah, at different times, I've shared parts of my story of working. One of my first times being paid to do quote unquote restorative justice work was community organizing, community engagement around this quote unquote restorative justice court in a Chicago neighborhood that was not that I think is harm reductive to people who were going through the criminal legal system, but like the values of restorative justice were not in that court, right? Did people avoid jail and prison time? Absolutely. And that is net positive. But to call something like that restorative justice, like what is that doing to the movement? And, they're building out another version of that court, right?
Exactly.
And that's wonderful for the people who will avoid prison. What does that mean for our movement?
Right.
Like we hold those two things in tension. And I don't know that there's like a silver bullet panacea answer to all of that.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think what I'm saying is, I think the movement can go forward while these services are happening, unless there's really intensive legislation that somehow hampers the movement. But I'm not seeing that happening too quickly. So as you said, we're really thankful to keep people out of prison. That's a sort of a baseline. It should be, I hope. But yeah, we're really concerned when we model our restorative justice work after the criminal legal system. The whole point is to try to pull away from that and reframe the possibilities of justice. So for instance, it's long past due that we start to say, no, we're not going to set up a program to divert people, but they still have a sentence and they still have to do probation and everything. We need to talk about things that totally divert folks. Not how do we keep them from getting into the system
and keep from giving the system more funding.
Exactly. And that was the third thing. Sorry, my friend who was doing this research on, and I'm having a senior moment because I'm not remembering her name, and when it comes to me, I'll get it back to you. She also said we have NGO'd the movement to death. I mean, if we're not careful, because that was the thing to do: set up the NGO and scramble for all this funding and beg for 5 or 6 cases a month from the court. Those days are over. We've got to figure out another way to do that, because that consumed our energy and kept us isolated in our separate projects and programs, and didn't have the impact of a movement at all.
Yeah, this is a paraphrase of Miriam Kaba, but talking about how as people we've outsourced our conflict resolution to the state, and our social service, our community, and outsourced community care work to social service organizations. And what are the things that we can do, again, that aren't on its face restorative or transformative justice, but what are the things that we can do to build those relationships and community, to maintain those relationships in a good way? That when I think about restorative justice and my framing of it, that's totally inclusive of that, building those relationships rooted in equity and trust, making sure that people in communities know each other and know people as resources, not hey, call this number and this caseworker will come and handle this for you.
And it's countercultural in the US. It's very countercultural because we've taken individualism to its height, to the place where we're such an isolated people, and we really need to understand what it means to build community again. And that's tough. That's why I think it's actually a movement, because it's starting to call whole collectives of people to think about how they relate to each other differently in order to do different things and have different results. And it's going to be challenging. I've seen restorative justice in other cosmologies, other settings where there's a different worldview, where there's a relational or communal worldview, and it's beautiful and it's stunning.
Yeah.
And I love Archbishop Desmond Tutu the late, who used to say, my humanity is all wrapped up in your humanity.
Yeah, I was hoping we would get to make a smooth transition back to some work that you did in South Africa. Perfect transition with the TRC and the work that you were doing there. What were some highlights, key learnings, just moments that you want to share?
Sure. So my connection to the TRC was unexpected. When I first arrived, we arrived in January of 1994. And so that was 4 months before the all-inclusive elections, when Mandela and the ANC were elected into power. So it was a really hazardous time. There was a lot of low-scale violence because there was a lot of political power mongering around who's going to be the chief opposition to the ANC. Everyone knew the ANC was going to win. They had a majority, but who was going to be the chief opposition, et cetera. And the white government was playing a third party role of spoiling and giving arms to other sides to make the place ungovernable. And there was a lot of really, really messy stuff. So the first year was totally consumed with sort of the the transition process. In 1995, December 1995 is when the TRC opened its doors, so to speak, or launched. And it was my South African colleagues who said to me, didn't you do something like victim offender, whatever, before you came? I was like, yeah, but that was like misdemeanor crimes, that's, yeah, let's not have that conversation. They were like,
yeah.
They were like, no, but we need that. There's people in the TRC, the amnesty applicants asking for that to meet their communities where they committed the political violence or the surviving families. And some of them are asking to meet the officers saying, how can we forgive unless we meet a human being? And I was like, But they really prevailed and helped to pull together their networks. And we ended up with a coalition of about 22 different NGOs, civil societies, religious actors, women, youth, folks who are counseling and trauma work, coming together. And we put a proposal together that we put before the TRC and basically explained a much more contextualized version of what would this look like potentially if we were to take cases from the TRC and handle them. Now, these are, gross human rights violations. It's a whole different subject matter. And they liked our proposal. And basically we were saying, we're not going to ask you to do more work. Just give us the referrals. We'll do all the prep. And I can't overemphasize the prep that's involved. Hours and hours of prep separately before you'd ever bring someone together. Bring groups, yes. And that's what we are most afraid of, is that unskilled facilitators and lack of prep would just make this whole process blow up. And while they understood that, they, meaning the TRC, we were working through one of the subcommittees called Reparations and Rehabilitation Subcommittee, the R&R Subcommittee. And they were so overwhelmed with their mandate, it was really hard for them to get a sort of efficient or effective referral process to us. So we didn't do as many cases, and there were times we were called in way too late. And so I could talk about failures and successes and not enough cases and a whole bunch of things that were deep learning. And the TRC was desperate to show that they were doing reconciliation, so they sometimes weren't patient enough with our process. So they would throw people together and run the cameras, and many of those ended in disaster, unfortunately. But so that's what we walked into, the minefield we walked into, and it was an incredible experience. And in the process, I got to know the inner workings of the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and was able to take part of some of the really in hearings, public hearings and meetings around their work, and help to mobilize when it came time for reparations. And the demands of the survivor communities, and so it was a deep learning curve for me, really important learning curve. Incredible moments of despair when things blew apart that we weren't part of, but we wished we could have to have made it less of a theatrical drama, which is what it ended up being, and more of a healing moment. The reparations thing is an interesting story. Many people don't know about. The ANC government balked at paying reparations or making reparations because they said, why are we paying for the sins of the apartheid government? Which was understandable, except that there was no more apartheid government. The ANC was now the government, and they had all the resources of the state. And so we had to challenge them to take responsibility for those who had suffered under apartheid. So then they said, well, we don't have the money. And so for about a year, there was sort of dilly-dallying around, and the survival communities were really, really frustrated. And then we caught wind of a arms agreement with Sweden. Okay, so let me get back up. The reparations package was recommending 3 to 5 billion rand. That's all it was going to cost. That's a drop in the bucket in South Africa's economy. So we caught wind that they spent 30 billion rand buying these Hitachi helicopters or something, high-tech Hawk helicopters or something. And so that was all the leverage we needed to make a lot of noise and say, hey, you said you didn't have money, but you can do this, aside from the fact that, Mandela promised not to sell into unstable regions. So there's a whole set of situations. Because those are anyway, that's a whole nother story. I'll leave that out. So we made enough noise that the ANC government then responded, but they made a once-off payment to every designated gross human rights violation victim. And there were certain categories. I mean, there was a whole bunch of people that didn't even fall in those categories. Like if you were jailed but not tortured, it wasn't considered a gross human rights violation, which is awful. If you had your house torn down and you were forcibly removed, it wasn't considered a gross human rights violation. So, but that's a whole nother discussion around transitional justice, restraints. And so, in any case, people were given a once-off payment, and it went quickly for most of the families, and it was really disappointing. And what resulted was a class action suit taken up by a New York firm that went after major industries, U.S. industries that stayed invested in South Africa all through apartheid. They didn't honor the sanctions. Kentucky Fried Chicken, Chrysler, Ford, and others, some petroleum companies and so on. So, that's the sort of thing that's not restorative. That's the restorative part of listen, I understood the surviving families looking for more acknowledgement and more relief from the tremendous loss and trauma that they were experiencing and still are.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind just off of that last piece of understanding, maybe even wanting a restorative solution, but the people who have caused harm or who are responsible for the harm or have the power to repair the harm, just not wanting to do that can very easily turn someone off to a restorative process.
Absolutely.
And I think that's justified. And the other thing that you brought up, unskilled facilitators, not doing enough prep. Whenever I talk about, one of my biggest mistakes, or my oh shit moment, very young doing this work. I was brought into a school. The first day, the principal was like, great, we've got these students. There's a fight. Go talk to them, bring them all together. And I want to make a good impression. So we got everyone in the room, and it did not go well just because we had not done that work. And so this work is so precious. It requires so much care. And, one of the things that you mentioned in the chapter, to bring it back, is when we talk about quote unquote scaling this movement, you've got to be so careful. Because we do want it to grow. We do want, I, using this platform, want to amplify restorative justice, right? And I know that people watching a 36-minute video that I have out on YouTube, just that very detailed explainer of what is restorative justice, has been helpful and transformational for some people, just their way of thinking. That doesn't mean that tomorrow you get to go and facilitate these processes in these spaces. It requires more, but how do we balance that without professionalizing it? There's so much to think about.
Absolutely.
I know that. Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
I was gonna say, I know that as I build out this organization, because that's what Amplify RJ is, the people who are encountering restorative justice work through me are not learning about restorative justice the way that I did, right? As somebody who had the privilege of having another job, another career as an X-ray tech, and took a side job as somebody who was working in an employment program, helping folks who were out of work find work. And those who had the hardest time were people who had records in the criminal legal system. And I'm saying this quickly for people who have heard me tell this story over and over.
Sure.
And along the way, I found the word restorative justice as what I thought at the time to be an alternative to the criminal legal system. And then I had the ability to, with my full-time other job, continue my schooling, go to grad school, and sit at the feet of many people who have been doing this work for a long time, and be the annoying college grad student and be like, hey, I'm new, I'm in college, can I come learn from you? And talking my way into a lot of different places. That's not something that everybody has the privilege to be able to do as we're teaching this work, right? Because
that's right.
You know, that's just not the way that the world worked for most people. And
That's right.
while I feel like that education was invaluable, it's not the only way to learn this work, right? If somebody takes this master's in conflict transformation from CJP with their internships and, the didactic learning, the technical learning, and the life experience in the field, like that's valid and beautiful and wonderful. But so is the learning that people have done at the feet of Indigenous elders, right? So is the learning that the people have done, in their communities as violence interrupters and ceasefire workers to keep peace. And when we're all talking about this framework of restorative justice, so many times that we can come into tension because like we're not using the exact same language, the exact same words. Frustrating, still beautiful. And I've been recently speaking with a group of Black men, and we're talking about, we're using the framework of Resmaa Menakem's My Grandmother's Hands to work through life. And one of the things that we talked about this last week is like, hope is beautiful. In the words of Miriam Kaba, hope is a discipline, but hope is heavy. There's so much space for disappointment, anger, sadness along the way in this beautiful world that we're trying to build using the words of restorative justice. Where do you continue to find hope?
Wow. That was just a beautiful segue all by itself. So, David, I have to sit there with that segue for just a little bit.
Sure.
Well, I mean, I can't help. Okay, when you've been in the field as long as I have, not that that's, there's nothing sacred about duration of time. It depends what you do with it, but I can't help but have hope, because what I've done is I have grabbed hold of, not literally, but the people and their stories and their narratives of resilience. And that gives me a tremendous amount of hope. I have people always coming to me who was so disparaging about Africa. And I lived 16 years in Africa. I traveled in 20 different countries. The continent left a huge imprint on my soul and my psyche and my spirit. And I'll never be able to get that. I'll never be able to ignore that. It's there and it's beautiful. And so I can think across the continent. I can see, these sparkling places where I know people doing incredible work day to day. They never make the news. They never, their stories aren't written. But I know their stories and I know what they're going through, and other people do too. And they're the people that are holding out in my mind. They're the people that show me the best face of our human being and our human condition. The ability to remain resilient and to hold on and to continue this work against incredible odds. There are so many people like that, and I could tell story after story. So I hang on to those stories and I tell those stories. And when I'm feeling discouraged, and there's been plenty of times, I've had my, oh shit, why am I even in this field moments, and so I tell the story of working with the Sierra Leone refugees. Right after the Sierra Leone Civil War, I was invited to accompany the refugees for about 2 weeks in Guinea-Conakry, which is the country beside Sierra Leone where the refugees had fled over the border. And we were doing peace building generally and so on with a set of select facilitators in the refugee camp. It was actually a combination of peace building content, and then there was other folks who were doing literacy, because there was a high non-literacy rate amongst the refugees. And so it was this great combination of The content was peace building and restorative justice and nonviolence, but the casing and the whole process was literacy development. In the process of working there, I happened to be there just when the international community, whoever that is, determined that all the fighters and the rebels and the armed groups that were fighting, and there were many in Sierra Leone, were given blanket amnesty. In transitional justice terms, blanket amnesty means as if nothing ever happened. Mm-mm. They're not going to be held accountable. They don't have to speak the truth. They can't go to trial. There won't be extra special courts or anything. It'll just be, that's the end. We blanket this period and we ask you to try to go on. A dreadful shortcut to restorative justice or reconciliation or peace or anything else in many ways. So I watched the community just divide. And of course, one side was really aggressive and angry and said, if they step back in my village, if I see the young people or the boys or the men or the fighters that did that, I'll kill them. And then there was others who just closed down, and I saw them fold in, and I saw them shaking their heads saying, what could we do? That was the only way we could have peace. We had to agree to that. We don't like it, but we had to agree to it. We just have to figure out how to live together. And that was apathy. So you had this aggression and this apathy, both of which were unchecked, were deeply discouraging, and not only discouraging, destructive for thinking about how are we going to rebuild. There was a ceasefire. We're talking about rebuilding. They are talking about rebuilding the country, and history tells us, the country, if it's revenge, it'll just keep the cycle going. And if it's apathy, a next generation will pick up the fight, for sure. They'll say that our grandparents, our parents didn't fight hard enough. And so neither of those are promising. And there had to be a third way. Up to that point, I had never thought of restorative justice. I had been through the TRC, but I had never really thought of it as something that could be applied in a war to peace transition. I went back to my accommodation that night and I was ticked. And I was like, why am I here? I should just pack up and go home. Where's justice? There's no justice here. I was basically saying, God, where's justice? There's no justice. It was really emotionally draining to be with them at that moment. And that night, I had sort of this epiphany, if you will, to say, try, think about restorative justice. Went back to the team and the leaders and said, okay, let's talk. Are you willing to talk about this? And they said, sure. So we did. And it was this fascinating discussion of starting off with the refugees saying, community folks saying, well, we don't have power. The international community has the legal power and they have the political power, and they've taken it from us. But we kept probing. And that's what I love about restorative justice is it asks different sets of questions. And when it asks different sets of questions, it gets different answers. And so we kept probing. And they started to talk about, well, we have this cultural ritual, this cultural practice. We have this religious or spiritual practice. We have these social ways in which we hold people accountable. And all of a sudden, they began to develop this incredible picture of asset-based restorative justice, culturally, spiritually, and socially. And they took that and went back to rebuilding their villages, saying, hey, these young people they weren't all young people, but a lot of them were. There was a lot of child soldiers used in the war, unfortunately, and deliberately and against their will, drugged and so on. But in any case, they said, they can come back and we can't put them on trial. We can't make them tell the truth. But what we can say is you are our son or our brother or our father or our uncle. And we believe your humanity can be restored. What you did was inhumane, but you are still human. And we will do everything in our cultural, social, and spiritual authority to reacclimate you into the human community. And that's what they did. And they had a special court from The Hague. They had the Truth Commission come in based on South African blueprint. Neither of them reached the local folks who literally at gunpoint had to do horrendous killing of each other in local villages and stuff like that. And so they started a movement, an indigenous movement called Family Talk, which in Creole means family talk. Started by a good friend of mine, John Cocker, who's the founder of it. He's the executive director of this international work now called Family Talk. And they've been going since 2007, 2008. They've reached thousands of people. They don't use the word restorative justice, but it has every element of sort of remorse, forgiveness, reparations, transaction, using ritual and processes that are understandable to the people on the ground. It's in their cosmology. They have cleansing processes, and then they feast together. And it's an incredible process around a bonfire. And you have to, you probably know about it already. So there's a film out on it and so on. But I make the argument, and I stand by it. And I say to the Transitional Justice fraternity, this is transitional justice. This is restorative transitional justice. It's a way of bringing healing and accountability together at a community level, and it's building justice. It's an incredible movement from the ground up. It's a bottom-up justice movement that's saying we'll heal ourselves, and we're the best people to do that. And that was restorative justice. I saw it in action then, and then I was like, yeah, this is possible at a large collective level. Now, there was a lot of values and so on, the collectivized mentality and worldview that helped assist that process. But if we're serious about our ideals of the Western justice system, when we see those being enacted, no matter what they're called or how they're done, then we need to take note. And I think Family Talk gives us an example of restorative justice at a collectivized level that has been incredibly successful in showing us a way that this can be done without someone from the outside hoisting a blueprint of some external process on a people that don't even understand it or aren't familiar with it.
What that has me thinking about is the US. And this might be like a whole different conversation, because you're talking about responding to harm that happened within years. When we're here in the US, we're talking about harm that's happened over centuries to Indigenous people, to stolen African people, and to people of the global majority who continue to be harmed by a systemic white supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that there is a restorative process that has happened like that. I mean, because like even thinking it back to like Nazi Germany and, you know, the work that's still being done 3-4 generations now to like help repair the harm, like the US hasn't really even like begun that process. And that might be a bigger conversation than we have time for today. But
sure.
You know, when you say you find hope in these stories, and I immediately want to take it to, but what about us? Right? Because I'm a selfish person.
Sure.
And want the best for myself, and now my child and other generations. But knowing that it works in some places, in those small spaces, talking about where this work is growing. Yeah, and I can even think about people who come back to me and talk about like where this works in their classroom, the conversation that they're able to have with their partner, their families, their parents about like the harm or the disconnects, the miscommunications. That's beautiful. And there's always hope for more. You talked earlier about the role that you're in now with the U.S. Institute of Peace seems like the perfect fit of blending in so many aspects of the work that you've done and who you are. What is that work? What are you excited about in that right now?
Well, I do want to say something to, the concept that you were mentioning, sort of historical harms.
Yeah.
And I mean, I'll just make one comment and say, certainly, while Sierra Leone had a 12-year civil war that could be sort of bookended, it was long in coming, and all of Africa has to go back to colonization before it can ever really talk about what's happening now, because there's such deep roots and connections there too. So that needs to be part of the analysis. I guess what gives me hope in our country here right now are, again, small but burgeoning movements. There are truth-telling projects popping up all over. I'm sure you've talked about that with some of your guests, starting with, the truth-telling project in Ferguson after 2014. So there's been some mapping of those truth-telling projects and efforts to support them, and that mapping is really incredible. And it's like lots of local efforts. And again, I think as a movement, we need to think about other ways to connect. One of the beautiful things was when they did they used the social media and got people connected in regions, all at the same, different time zones, but all at the same time, telling their stories of their experiences of violence and harm at the hands of the police. But the other two, and you've probably either had guests on that have talked about them, or you certainly know about them, but I'll put a shout out for those who are listening maybe for the first time. The one is Coming to the Table, that movement, CTTT, where we have folks, the ancestors of those who were enslaved and those who were enslavers, coming together intentionally to have conversations across all of these deeply divided issues, and finding ways to face the history together. They have a 4-part process: face the history together, build relationship, jointly do healing work, and then think about an action they can take together as a local community across these divides. So there's been some great work. A lot of it is maybe symbolic. A lot of it is very, very deep personal work that happens. But that's something that I'm delighted to watch take off. And there's chapters that keep growing and opening up. And Jody Geddes and Tom DeWolf write the little book on the Coming to the Table process too. The other one is Dr. David Anderson Hooker. Maybe you've had him on here too, but his little book on transformative community conferencing, where he's been working with narrative and the idea of how to help communities talk through the narrative of the history and identify the conflict-saturated narrative that they've lived by, and figure out how do we begin to work through that conflict-saturated narrative. And find ways to not re-narrate in order to go into some nana land, but to think about what assets and resources do we have, and what is our vision for the future, and how do we want to get there, and how do we want to work our relationships out as we go. And so it's a lot of double listening for what people are saying or not saying. It's a lot of listening for the critical in between messages that are being sent as communities come together across these divides and try to work at things. And there are many other movements. I'm thinking of the RJ hubs in Chicago, at least 5 of those, where they're opening up a space for young people to just decide what they want to do in that space, how to lead, and making them police-free zones, and having community circles where folks are processing the issues of the community. These are all signs of hope for me in this process. And then we've got the legislation. We've got Representative Barbara Lee, who's put forward the Truth and Racial Healing and Transformation legislation and also the reparations legislation, which of course has more controversy surrounding it, but there's gaining interest on Rep-Lee's legislation. There's a lot of work that would need to be done to figure out how would a truth-telling process look in this country. And my hat's off to vocal proponents of that, like Dr. Fania Davis, who are making incredible inroads and challenging and inspiring so many of us in this work of figuring out, can we bring our warrior selves and our healer selves together, as she so aptly says about her own walk.
Yeah. Sometimes these conversations with my guests are like more hopeful than I'm willing to be in a moment.
Yeah. I understand.
Yeah.
There's many moments. I mean, of course I'm talking. I have to talk myself into this hope sometimes too. There are certainly many moments when I'm reading the news or hearing one more Twitter or whatever thing and saying, wow, what's wrong with us?
Yeah, because we can't divorce ourselves from what's happening. Like, we are both harmed and contributors to these systems that continue to perpetuate harm.
That's right.
I don't know if you fully got to share, what's exciting you about.
Yes, that was the second part of that. Yeah. So some of the projects that I'm involved with, which give me energy, the first thing I was asked to do was do sort of what they call an evidence review, which sounds very academic, but it was sort of a scan of the reconciliation field and trying to help to understand reconciliation, because reconciliation is one of those words that's just way overused and used for everything, and often anecdotal and sort of accused of being fluffy and just being problematic. Let me just name that, in the English language, means returning to, and we're not returning to good relationships in many of the historical harms. We were never there. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, the same argument happened in Truth Commission in South Africa. It's like, we should call this the Truth and Conciliation Commission, because we're not really reconciling. We were never reconciled. Thank you very much. So this is our challenge. And yet it's a word that holds also a lot of depth and weight. And so what we're trying to do is center that a little bit more. There's a few things that concerned us about reconciliation. It was often left to the very end. If you have a linear view of this conflict thing and you hope it happens at the end, maybe if people are really, big spirited, it might be the cherry on top of the cake. But if it doesn't happen, then it doesn't happen. If it does happen, well, great. It's because of this combination of people or whatever. We think we can be much more intentional about it. We think we need to think about what are the theories of change, whether we've named them or not, that are driving reconciliation. And in fact, what we do know from research in peace building is that many of the mediated and negotiated agreements of national level are unraveling. They're crumbling within 5 years of a supposed successful agreement. So we're in a real quagmire as a peace building field right now. We're sort of in trying to do damage control for, and I think my personal perspective is exactly what we've been talking about in restorative justice. We have made mediation and negotiation into a technical, formulaic process that we train diplomats in. They go in with their briefcases and go back out. And what we've forgotten is the ancient path of relationship. Yeah. And reconciliation is that ancient path. And so reconciliation is appropriate in the thick of the conflict. In other words, everywhere I go, even in the midst of, all out war happening, there was always some people seeing the conflict with two eyes and reaching out and saying, let's try to heal together, or reaching across the divide of whatever the conflict divide is and saying, come, let's dialogue, or let's together heal, or let's talk about what's going on. Let's work together to rebuild this part of the community. And that's the reconciliation we need to look for and try to encourage. So that's one of the things we're doing. we're also developing a reconciliation course, which is an online asynchronous course. USIP offers a number of different courses. I'm involved in a number of other areas of projects, and this is in the function of one of the reasons I appreciate my role at USIP is it's an accompaniment role. It's a supportive role. We have local teams in Colombia, in Afghanistan, in the Philippines who are doing the work on the ground. What we're doing is coming alongside, if we're invited, and trying to walk with them, bringing in some case study comparisons, some training maybe, or capacity, whatever, or just coaching. But we're in a second place. It's not it doesn't feel at my age that I should be in the front lines. Maybe I never should have been, and doing the hands-on work. So it feels like an appropriate space of support. And so in that space, there's conversations with some restorative justice work with ex-FARC in Colombia who have apologized and are talking about reintegration back into the community. There's some conversation about, there's been a peace agreement with the Bangsamoro Transitional Authority in the Philippines, in Mindanao. And this is this was a decadal resistance movement that finally came to a peace agreement with the central government of the Philippines. And now they need to implement their peace agreement so that their people can begin to feel the fruits of that peace. And so they're asking for various partners to come alongside them. We're in conversation with the conflict in Cameroon, which is there's an armed struggle in Cameroon, West Africa right now. And we're working with the diaspora and some folks inside and trying to figure out what is an appropriate role. So these are the kinds of things that give me energy. Last Friday, we had 25 African diplomats who've just been recently stationed in DC in their embassies. And we had them together to look at peace building and do a simulation around peace building work. They were also looking at how does the government work here, and networking and private and public partnerships and that kind of thing. So that's just a spattering of the kind of work that I'm doing. Yeah.
I'm in some ways odd. It's like, there's so much work. There's so much to be done. And I want to start to transition us to close.
Sure.
When we're thinking about you've done all this work across the globe. What has this way of being meant for you, Carl, in your life as a person, navigating the relationships that you're a part of?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question, because I really don't feel like we can sustain ourselves in this work if we're not doing the inner work. Dr. Ram Bhagat, who's amazing colleague and friend, who is the Restorative Justice Coordinator for the Richmond Public Schools. He says, we are the work. For me, it touches on so many different parts of who I am, back to my faith. To me, restorative justice has been an incredible formative process to how I understand God, and how I think God works with his creation, the creation, us, and the spirit. Because I certainly feel like restorative justice feels really close to my experience of faith. That I try to listen to the spirit, who's my sort of accountability. It says, hey, don't do this or don't say that, and go here and go there. But and that's through many disciplines of prayer and other forms of spiritual discipline. So that's the accountability part. But then I think the love and the ability to walk out in being called and sort of feel a call and a purpose and a destiny is all part of that in my spiritual walk. It's affected my marriage for sure, I hope. I think it has. No, in the way my wife and I have processed our conflicts and understood. She grew up in the Middle East. I grew up in Asia, very different ways of doing conflict. So when we first met, there was an interesting moment. And so we've grown sort of iron sharpening iron and found out what it means to be restorative in multiple ways, tone and language, as well as speech and action. It's certainly affected my parenting. In fact, Carol and I have toyed with writing a little bit more about restorative parenting. We're not quite sure that we even used the words initially, but it became really important for us in how we relate to our children. And early on, we had them in circle. We didn't call it that. We called it family meetings. But early on, they were in family meetings where we gave over the leadership of those meetings. We passed it around. And almost everything was on the table for discussion. There was a few things, obviously, age specific, that weren't on the table. Like, you have to go to sleep. You have to go to bed at a certain time, and you have to eat certain things and stuff like that. But otherwise, that was a moment, and we often did save that for the family meeting, and we had them regularly. And it was moments when our kids could say, Dad, you overreacted there. And they wouldn't use the word harmful probably, but it was harmful. And I had an opportunity then to say, I'm sorry. And let's see how we can do this differently. And those relationships remain really strong to this day. I hope it has affected the way I work and am with people, how my presence and how I sit with people. And in my facilitation, it's helped me to become much more grounded and more centered and hopefully less performative.
That last one hit me. I was talking earlier today about how in my facilitation, especially when I'm teaching, I know the stories to tell. They're very well rehearsed, sure. Right? And I know you on the receiving end are going to have a very emotional experience with this. And to me, this is just Tuesday. This is what I do, right?
Yeah.
And it's and I don't know if we were on air or off when we were saying this, but in my day-to-day work doing this restorative justice life, it's marketing, it's content creation, it's messaging,
right? You're framing
this. To bring people into the space. And like, once I get people into the space, like sometimes I'm exhausted by like all the other things. And so it's easy to go on to autopilot, but like the ability to be present, even in virtual space, like really does translate. And, we have built like really beautiful relationships over the past 2 years with people who I have never met in person and will probably never meet.
Sure.
I guess we can subtly plug, unless they come to the NACRJ conference in Chicago.
That's right.
9 coming up. But it is a really good reminder of like, the way that you do anything is the way that you do everything. And this plays such a huge part in all of this. In some ways, this has brought us to like a lovely close, but there's still like the fun questions at the end that everybody answers. Do you have time?
Sure, absolutely. I just wanted to say one thing. Storytelling is a gift, and it's a great gift. And so I use storytelling a lot too, and I fully understand what you're saying. I drop it in at different points and know what strings it will push and pull or whatever. But I do think that's the power of storytelling. The storytelling really is to grab us in an embodied way and have us have that sort of heart and head reaction And sometimes stories are just fun and enjoyable and make us laugh, which is also really healing. But yeah, there's a fine line between that and when we're performing. And I want to be sensitive to how it is that I'm present in a group. Yeah. Anyway, let's go to the final questions.
Yeah, I feel like you've answered some of these in the stories that you've already told. So I'm gonna jump to one of my favorites, which is you get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they? And what is the one question you ask the circle?
Oh, wow. That's cool. That is, I'm going through, let me tell you what's going on. I'm just gonna, I'm going through my head and there's all these faces and names and stories going through my head. And I'm like, this is the cloud of witnesses I'd love to sit in circle with. Some of them are alive and some of them are dead.
Pick 4.
Pick 4.
Yeah.
I would, wow, I would love to sit in circle with so there's some people I'd love to get together in a circle. Okay, Murunzi Matsabani. Murunzi, I shadowed him in South Africa for 2 years. The first 2 years I was there in the NGO I was working in, South Africa. He had spent 14 years on Robben Island with Mandela. Came out, went right back to the same work. He was part of the AZAPO, which is the Azanian People's Organization, which is the political movement that grew out of Steve Biko's work. And so he was put in prison because of his political activities in the mid-70s, accused of being in a communist ring or something. So the prime of his life was taken from him, age 26 to 40. But when I met him, and I had the chance to meet him at a conference before I went to South Africa, and he just blew me away, just open and sitting with me, and he didn't have any reason to be that way, and he was just what we call a mini Mandela. And I watched him then do his work over, I was with him when the election days happened, and we watched lines of people voting for the first time in their lives. And I watched him negotiate with white police officers who more than likely probably helped to get him in prison, or at least the stations in the East Rand where we were working were that way. I saw him mediating in ethnic conflicts amongst mine workers in the gold mines. And he knew 6 languages. I don't know how to explain Murunzi except that he blew me away. And it was a tremendous privilege. And he opened up doors and for me, and relationships and networks that I'll never, ever be able to repay. And I would love to ask him a lot more questions about, what motivated him to just be such an incredible, open, gracious, merciful person. Restorative. He didn't even use that language, but restorative in so many ways. So Murunzi would be one. I'd love to see him in conversation with someone like Fania Davis. I'd love to have them in the same room and circle together. And I have the utmost respect for Fania. She's a good colleague and friend. But as I mentioned before, her story of bringing together her warrior self and her healer self, and finding that in her expression of restorative justice and her inspiration. I love being in circle with her. I've actually been in circle with her before, so maybe that doesn't count. And then I think of I think of Kethla Kumalo. Kethla was the other person, the very first person I worked with in South Africa. He was the best negotiator I think I've ever watched work. He had helped to negotiate a truce between taxi violence at the time that was also politicized. They were basically, each community was ambushing the taxis, the public taxis, when they came out of the other community because they were assumed to be full of the enemy. And he had negotiated this agreement where they had a truce and a ceasefire because they all decided we all need the public transportation system to be safe. Our children need to get to school, and our spouses and our family members need to travel safely. And so I watched him work between these divided communities. This would have been the ANC and their armed wing, and the IFP, the Inkatha Freedom Party, which was the chief opposition to the ANC at the time, and their armed wing. And I watched him move, and I shadowed him again at these meetings on a weekly basis called the Joint Monitoring Committee. And I watched him do his work so well that the taxi associations put him under death threat because he was solving problems, and they liked to take over routes and ranks because it meant more money and more profit, almost like a mafioso. If they had enough gun power, they could take smaller taxi ranks out of business. And I watched his life go under threat, and then we were trying to protect him. He refused to get out of the industry altogether because he was too loyal and too committed. And he eventually got lured back to a peace agreement, which he thought was a legitimate peace agreement with the taxi associations and the regional provincial government. But it was a setup. And when he drove home after signing the peace agreement, he was run off the road and assassinated. The only good that came out of that is we ended up, or a whole bunch of smaller taxi associations amalgamated and made one bigger one that made them a force to contend with, as opposed to with these other bigger associations. They couldn't quite take them over as easily. But we lost him, and he left 4 children behind. And I would love Kethla to be in that circle and talk about what motivated him to put his life on the line for this restorative work. He was so committed to his people and he was from the Zulu nation, which was often known as the warriors, fighters. Traditionally, it's one of those stereotypes of ethnic groups. And he was a peace builder, a restorative activist in so many ways. I'm now 3, 4. Sorry, I'm giving little biographies, but these people are really, amazing to me, and they mean a great deal to me. I think of a pastor friend. Well, actually, he's an elder. His name is Dr. Mulanda Juma. He's in the Congo. And he grew up in war in Bukavu in the Eastern Congo. 1,000 people were killed in his village in one weekend when he was at boarding school. And he fled to South Africa in 1998. Went through a lot of trauma healing and work. And then he and I worked together, and he ended up doing his master's and his PhD work in conflict studies. And he helped develop peace clubs all over Burundi, or parts of Burundi and the Congo and Zambia. These are clubs that really promoted peace, but also restorative justice and other issues in schools and in the community at large. And wherever they were invited, they went into prison systems too. And Mulanda is a hero for me on the continent. He stayed on the continent, committed to his people. He's in Congo now doing the work. And there's others like him, John Calker I mentioned, but I'll stop. Those 4 I'd put together. That would be an interesting circle.
And what is the question you ask that circle? One question to kick that circle off.
What makes your spirit soar to do the work that you keep doing over decades and decades of time.
The reason that this is fun is because now I get to turn that question back to you.
It's a calling. I don't know what else to say, and I don't mean that in a I get up every morning and exercise and get excited to go into my day. Not always, but it's a calling. I can't veer from it right now. It's a bit. I'm too deep into it to go back now. That doesn't sound very hopeful either, but you know what I mean? I'm so deep in it that it would betray myself and what I've given my life to turn around and try to do something totally different. It would. There's a purpose in a drawing, like a beckoning, like a wooing that happens for me. And I take every day to spend a little time meditating and praying and just getting my headspace in a place where I can hit the ground and still be sensitive enough to not lose track of what I'm supposed to, with the most important things I'm supposed to do that day, regardless of how many meetings I have.
Yeah. Thank you. These next couple might be a little bit faster, but we have.
I hope so. I'll try to.
No worries. We have hundreds, probably right now, potentially thousands and millions later, of people listening to this conversation. What's one thing you want them to know? Might be an affirmation, might be a mantra, might be something else.
Something that the pastor of the church that I go to now, and it's an interracial church, and he's our senior leader in the whole pastoral team is African American, Chris Johnson, and he says, "You were built for this." He tells us that over and over again, and I want to say that to folks. We talk about, we laugh and say, "Oh, that's idealistic," and in your dreams. But I think we as humans were built for this. And you might not see it in your generation, but you're built for this in order for the next generations to reap the benefits. So we're built for this work. Even the neuroscience is telling us we were built for this work. They're finding out that our brains are actually not inclined to isolate. They're inclined to go towards community and try to make connection. So we were built for this as far away as the goal seems to be sometimes. And for me, I think a lot of what Mandela said in his 27 years of prison, when he was asked about his commitment to reconciliation, he said, "I kept my eyes on a horizon of reconciliation." I want to keep our eyes on a horizon of restorative justice.
Yeah, beautiful. Last two. This one's also fun because it requires you to do some work for me, who's one person that I should have on this podcast, and you have to help me make that connect.
Sure. Yeah, I don't know. I'll probably name a bunch of folk that you've already had on this. Have you had Dr. David Anderson Hooker?
I have not.
He's great. Highly recommend him. He's got a little book that came out in 2016 called Transformative Community Conferencing, which is not conferencing as we know it traditionally, but is and I'd be happy to connect you with him. Dr. Talia Gonzalez, you maybe have had her.
I haven't had her. I should. What's funny is that there are all these people who you're gonna name, and I would be like, oh yeah, I should email her. Oh yeah, I should reach out to them. And over the course of 70 episodes, there have been so many different people. And I think one of the beautiful things about the restorative justice world is that many of these people are just an email away, a
Right.
phone call away, a DM
Right.
away. But yeah, definitely should reach back out to her.
Both of those I would
Yeah.
recommend right off the bat.
Beautiful. And then finally, how and where can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
Well, that's a great question too. Okay, on a very, very basic level, I love being able to talk about restorative justice and tell this story wherever I can. And so I do try to take platforms that open it up. So happy to do that, whether it's a podcast or an actual event or an online presentation or a presentation to a class. I'm an ambassador for this thing, maybe self-appointed, probably, but that's I'm ready to talk about it and want to talk about it as much as I can. And then I guess I would say, in the broadest sense of the word, the mission statement of USIP is peace is possible. And then there's a whole bunch more to it. It's possible and practical and blah, blah, blah. But it's sort of cliche, but I think we have lost track of how inordinate amount of resources we have put into war, into conflict, into violence as a means to try to change people's behavior or solve problems. And we have yet to even understand just a slither of those resources being put into the work of peace. And USIP is one of the main and only that I know of dedicated quasi-state peace-focused efforts. And so we want to keep that vision alive.
Beautiful.
And there's been some folks that don't agree with that, as you can fully imagine.
Of course. But I mean, we'll leave links to USIP's work, your work in the show notes. Go ahead.
And yeah, I mean, anything you're saying and doing with the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding and the folks who are continuing to carry on the Zehr Institute. That's John Swartz and Dr. Kathy Evans there at atEMU. Any support that they can get to along the way is fantastic.
Beautiful. We'll make sure that all of that information is down below for people. Thank you so much for giving us your stories and the wisdom and experience that's come with them. It's been a true pleasure, and I can't wait to share this conversation with our audience. There's so much that I picked up, and I know others will as well. Any other words that you want to leave the people with?
I think I'm finished, but thank you for the vital work that you do. I really appreciate it, David, and keep. I mentioned in the book that there's these three pillars to a social movement. The political opportunity, the resource mobilization, and the last is the messaging and the framing. And you're helping us do that as a field of restorative justice. So thank you.
Beautiful. Well, I receive that and encourage others to continue to amplify this work and share this with somebody who you think would really benefit from this conversation. Again, Carl, thank you so much. To everyone else listening, take care, and we'll be back with another episode, a conversation with someone living this restorative justice life next week.
Hey folks, Elise here. Thank you so much to Carl for all you had to offer this episode. There are so many different things that we can take away, and one thing that I really wanted to focus on was messaging and framing. How much emphasis should we put on the delivery of a message versus the message itself? Can the message be compromised by adapting to appeal to certain audiences, or should we be trying to cater to audiences to spread the messages of restorative justice even further and generate a farther reach? I thought this was something that he kind of touched upon in the episode, just speaking on kind of the radicalization of how we talk about restorative justice. So I pose to you, when you think about how you share this work and get more people involved, how much time and how much effort are you putting into the messaging, and how much are you putting into the message? One other important point that I thought he brought up in this episode was peace is possible. This has been something that we have heard in a lot of different episodes. Peace is possible. And since it is possible, no justice, no peace, we have to think about how we are interlocking these two goals. How do you keep peace at the center of your restorative justice work and the center of your heart at all times? I think these questions are so important to ask ourselves on a daily basis, and if you want to hear more questions that I can come up with, that we can come up with, make sure to sign up for our Mighty Networks community, where we have podcast discussion groups as well as important, prominent questions, so you can ask yourself. It's almost like a journal, checking in with yourself every day, every week, with a bunch of different important prompts about restorative justice. As always, thank you so much for listening to this podcast, and I'll talk to you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. Or if you're old school, tell a friend. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, signing up for a community gathering, workshop, or course. So many options. Links to everything in the show notes, or on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.